The Awakening from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 14. Fertid. Zechariah and David walked through the streets of Cherebdim, which were already beginning to show signs of the human populace stirring to do their daily duties. They wore the day travel cloaks, and they had again covered the levicart to make it look like a covered wagon of goods. So much had happened since they had left Cherebdim, it felt like more than just an evening had passed. The people who walked past them gave them hardly a glance, despite what David considered to be their odd appearance, but as a point of fact, they looked just like everyone else. Besides the strange floating vehicle they pulled behind them, Zechariah and David could be anyone in their dark cloaks, and these people were probably used to seeing Fempiror come into their town to the safe house run by the Fempiror Eldritch, whether they realized it or not. As another point of fact, regular people probably stayed there with remarkable regularity, and thought nothing of the covered windows. He wondered if there was a family in Cherebdim who knew the loss his family must be feeling at this time. Had that son ever returned to tell his family the truth? Do they still wonder if he's out there somewhere? Or was that son taken by the Tepish that Zechariah so worried about, never to return? Was he truly dead? Did Zechariah kill him last night? Zechariah did not kill Tepish last night, though. He had killed members of the police force in Aram, just simple people doing their job to protect a town from the lunatic ravings of a madman. Zechariah was fully convinced that this was all the work of a faction called the Tepish, a faction deemed dead and gone by nearly everyone except Zechariah and his small circle of friends. David wondered if he was on the right side or not. The pair walked into the alley that concealed the large door to the side of the Rostem safe house. Zechariah walked directly to the well-worn spot on the wall and knocked. As before, the door opened to admit them and the levicart. Zechariah stowed the cart, and then he and David removed their day travel cloaks and stored them in the levicart before moving quickly into the common room. Eldritch looked up at them and then directed their gaze to Tiberius waiting for them at a table. Tiberius looked amused more than anything else, which David found surprising considering the mess that Zechariah had created. He wondered if this would affect Tiberius and his art of Jejunga business that rested in the heart of Aram. They sat with Tiberius, and Zechariah briefly explained everything that had transpired since they left the council room. Tiberius said nothing, but only nodded thoughtfully. As Zechariah spoke, Eldritch brought them all food and drink. Finally, when Zechariah finished with the chase through the trees, Tiberius smiled. "Well, it looks like you really stirred them up last night. Good show." Zechariah shook his head in frustration. "I cannot believe how thick they are to sit there so blindly," he said, trailing off. Tiberius shrugged. "It is a worthless venture to ponder their motives anymore," he said. "I often wonder who they work for." "What does Vladimir think?" Zechariah asked. "Ask him when he arrives," Tiberius said, chasing his words with a drink. The door from the levicart storage opened, and Vladimir entered, dressed in his day travel cloak over blue breeches and waistcoat, with white stockings and shirt. "Zechariah, you crazy Malklek," he exclaimed, not even waiting for a greeting. "Do you have any idea what the council went through after your little display?" "Ask me if I care," Zechariah said shortly. "You killed several of Aram's security force," Vladimir went on. "You know how serious a crime that is. How can I protect you when you're doing things like this?" "Do you know how infuriating it is to be wanted for upholding the code we've used for over 350 years?" Zechariah asked in return, not even bothering to stand and welcome. Vladimir did not break his anger or his gaze with Zechariah. "I could lose my position for just talking to you," Vladimir said, walking to the table. "I hope you do. It's certainly not worth keeping. The council no longer desires peace, despite its lofty claims." "You cannot achieve peace by inciting war. You can, however, find yourself in a war by claiming peace. You can't reason with the Tepish. You can't sign a treaty. They will see your indecision and docility and take over. You don't get peace when you take no action. You get annihilation." "That's a rather cold outlook." "It's reality. I won't feign peace when it does not exist." Silence enveloped the company. Vladimir still stood near them, holding Zechariah's stare, as if they were trying to stare each other down. Finally, Tiberius cleared his throat. "Well, Vladimir," he said uncomfortably, "welcome. We appreciate your presence." "We need to find their home area," Zechariah said, not acknowledging Tiberius at all. Suddenly, the main entry door to the common room slammed open. The door appeared to lead to the outside, though there was a small foyer of some kind to separate the outside door from this inner room. In the doorway stood a Fempiror in a day travel cloak, but the cloak was torn and cut in several places, and David could see where the sun had burned the Fempiror's skin. The newcomer's face was dirty and burned as well, but he did not appear to be much older than David's oldest brother was, unlike the majority of the Fempiror David had met to this point. The Fempiror took a few deep breaths as he looked around the room at the surprised faces that beheld his appearance, and then collapsed onto the floor. Ildrich was at the stranger's side in an instant, along with Tiberius, Zechariah, and several of the other patrons from the common room. "Zechariah, would you carry him for me?" Ildrich asked. "I'll get a room key." Zechariah nodded and effortlessly lifted the stranger from the ground as Ildrich ran behind the counter and took a key from his rack of room keys. "Follow me," Ildrich said, moving ahead of Zechariah. They entered the hall of rooms, and Ildrich opened the first one. Zechariah carried the stranger in and set him down on the bed. Ildrich was already out of the room when David, Tiberius, and Vladimir entered. Zechariah tore the day travel cloak from the stranger and set it off to one side. The stranger had blond hair that ran just past his shoulders, and he was dressed in black clothing similar to Zechariah's that had been sliced even worse than his cloak, exposing the skin underneath, which seemed to be equal parts burned and cut. On his wrists and ankles were dark metal gauntlets that had many fresh grooves in them from whatever he had experienced before getting to Krebdim. Ildrich returned carrying water and bandages. Zechariah stood back to allow Ildrich to work, ready in case he needed any help. "What do you think?" Tiberius asked Zechariah. "He looks like an Alewo," Zechariah said with a considerable amount of surprise in his voice, while never taking his eyes from the stranger. Ildrich looked up in surprise. "Really?" he asked. "They haven't been seen since the Tepish came about." "I know," Zechariah said, "but look at him." Vladimir nodded thoughtfully. "His garb does resemble the old order," he said. "And he doesn't have a weapon," Zechariah pointed out. "He might have lost it," Tiberius suggested. "Or it was taken from him," Ildrich added. Zechariah seemed unmoved by the suggestions. "Tiberius," Zechariah said, "do you know where the Alewo are supposed to be these days?" "No," Tiberius replied. "When they left, I heard they settled in some caves in the mountains out west." "The mountains out west near Hoggenstown?" Vladimir asked in surprise. "Isn't that where—" "It's near, where I suspected the buildup of Tepish forces 25 years ago," Zechariah finished. "Perhaps he escaped," Ildrich suggested. "We need to go there," Zechariah said with that sense of urgency he always seemed to have in his voice. Tiberius shook his head. "Zechariah, we can't assume every attack is Tepish related," he said. "We also can't assume this Fempiror is an Alewo. It's a full night's journey to those mountains, and we don't even know which one the Alewo are supposed to be in." Zechariah could not be dissuaded. "Then we wake him up and find out," he said, turning to the sleeping stranger. Ildrich suddenly stood in his way. "This Fempiror is my guest," Ildrich said with no humor in his voice, "and he needs to sleep. I will not have you disturbing him." Vladimir put his hand on Zechariah's shoulder. "We'll wait," Vladimir said to Ildrich. "Get some rest," Ildrich said. "All of you. I'll let you know if he says anything." "Agreed," Tiberius said, nodding. "If our destination is beyond Hoggenstown, then we'll need our energy. The last part of a journey like that will be in day travel cloaks. There are no safe houses out there." The stranger woke up some time later. They had elected to sleep in a room with several single beds in it, so Ildrich could inform them all at the same time. When Ildrich had let them know, it seemed as if no one had slept. David followed the three old Rostem as Ildrich led them back to the stranger's room. "He's still very weak," Ildrich explained, but he insisted on telling someone what had happened. "Is he from the mountains?" Zechariah asked. Ildrich shrugged. "He mentioned a plateau, but I don't know for sure," he said. "I've been here for so long I don't rightly know where anything is anymore. You can judge for yourself when you speak to him." Ildrich had told the truth about the stranger's state. He was awake, and he was sitting up, but he did not look the least bit recovered from his ordeal. As they all entered his room, he regarded each of them with the utmost seriousness. His face betrayed no emotion, bad or good, at the Fempiror who gathered to hear his story. Ildrich had placed 4 chairs in the room. Zechariah, Tiberius, and Vladimir sat down immediately. David glanced at Ildrich, who gestured for him to sit. He did, and the stranger seemed to regard him the most seriously of all. He looked away from David across each of their faces. "My name is Fertid," he said. "I am of the dark west Fempiror who reside in the Erufdium Plateau. Do you know where this is?" The 3 Rostim nodded solemnly. David only listened. "The numbers of our guests are now overwhelming, and though they profess peace, we have learned differently. 5 there were that the Deldral of the Dark West charged to find those who can help us, but they learned of our plan, and only I escaped in one of their levicarts. Wounded as I was, they did not give up the chase. 4 of their warriors chased me on their own cart, so I locked my controls to continue my forward momentum and face them. Their first warrior leaped across the gap to my cart, and though he was armed with a sword, I defeated him easily. He fell from the back of my cart to the ground, but the next 2 followed quickly in his stead. 2 against 1 was a more difficult battle, but my superior training shone through. I threw the second warrior from my cart, but the third was more difficult. It was during this battle that I discovered we were on a course for a series of rocks bordering the side of the mountain. I delivered a blow to the 3rd warrior, and he was thrown from the back of my cart. I had little time but to jump from the back of my cart to the trailing cart, before mine met its end against the rocks. The driver of their cart was of no consequence, and easily defeated. I took to the controls but noticed that the cart was losing speed quickly. Then the rear of the cart dipped sharply, and before I knew it the back was dragging the ground, bringing me to a halt. I learned that the 3rd warrior had not met his end when he fell from my cart. Instead, he latched himself onto the side of his own cart, and rather than immediately climb on board, he had run his sword through the propulsion and lift coils at the rear of the cart. With the cart destroyed beyond my knowledge of repair, I leaped out of it to face this foe a second time. On the plains outside the plateau I defeated him again, but he had already inflicted a greater blow. I had no time to think. I ran to the wreck, took a day-travel cloak, and came here as fast as I could, for the Deldral had told me of a Rostim presence here." "Fertid," Zechariah said, "can you describe your attackers to us?" Fertid looked at him calmly. "Of course," he said. "Their dress is the same throughout. Their armor is black as a whole, though they have an insignia of a bat etched on the breastplate in red. Red cloth connects their armor from neck to knee, and they wear gauntlets much like mine, also bordered in red. They wear helmets that protect their heads and the back of their neck, but are open in the front." At that description, Zechariah stood and turned. It was hard to say whether his face betrayed anger or realization. He turned after a moment and looked directly at Fertid. "That is your description of them," Zechariah confirmed. "There is no doubt in your mind about that?" "None," said Fertid, "but I must confess that I wonder whether I have come to the right people." He pointed to David. "This young one appears to be very new to our way of life. I was under the impression that there was only one faction that actively practiced transmutation." "We rescued him," Zechariah said. "We did not change him." "I assure you that you have come to the right place," Tiberius said reassuringly. "We will do what we can." Fertid smiled for the first time since they had met him. "We are in your debt," he said. "But be warned, do not mention me to anyone you see. To protect you and the one who sent me, I cannot tell you his name, but he will know why you have come. We are in grave danger, and I fear we are not the last to be so." "You have nothing to fear," Zechariah said. "Tell me one more thing, though. Are you of the Alewo?" Fertid smiled again. "If you have asked the question, then you already know the answer," he said simply. He moved back down on the bed and closed his eyes. Quietly, the 5 of them left the room. Ildrich closed the door behind them. They thanked Ildrich and moved down the hall back to their room. Ildrich walked the other direction back to the common room. As soon as they closed their door, Zechariah turned to Vladimir. "Well," Zechariah asked, "do you think your precious council will be convinced now? That description exactly matches the Tepish armor of old." Vladimir sighed and shook his head. They won't listen to it, he said. You have to understand that they are interested in keeping people happy, and this sort of thing doesn't appeal to them. Zechariah sighed and turned to Tiberius. Wouldn't you agree it's at least worth checking out? Zechariah asked. Tiberius nodded. I agree, he said. We need to confirm what he has said at the very least, and maybe we can do something about it. When are we leaving? Vladimir asked. Zechariah turned to him, surprised. You aren't needed? Tiberius asked. Vladimir shook his head. The council will not gather again for several weeks, he replied. We would not have any time soon, but for Zechariah's Code 57. Zechariah scoffed. My deepest apologies for disrupting the council's busy lives and forcing them to concentrate on the people. Vladimir shook his head again, this time with his eyes closed. Tiberius chose not to acknowledge the comment. Zechariah, when should we leave? Tiberius asked. It's just west of Hoggenstown. We can leave at sunset and be at the Eruftium Caves just before sunrise, Zechariah replied. We can reach the Dark West stronghold using day travel cloaks. Who else will be going with us? Vladimir asked. I feel the fewer the better, just to assess the situation, Tiberius said to Vladimir. Zechariah has David. I will ride with Kaltesh, and you can be with Yori. I want to be ready in case there is a problem, but I don't want all our warriors there to be destroyed. I'll leave instructions on what to do if we aren't heard from in a few days. David was getting lost very quickly. First, there was this stranger, Fertid, bringing himself together long enough to tell a story that happened at about the same time that he and Zechariah were meeting with Tiberius and Aram. Now they were bringing in more Rostem, he assumed, to go out to somewhere near Hoggenstown to see about some dark west Fempiror being overwhelmed. He needed to sort this out. What do these Tepish want, anyway? David asked. If they did take over your council, haven't they won already? What else is left? The three Rostem looked at each other briefly, David having interrupted their discussion. Tiberius nodded to Vladimir. The Fempiror society stands with humanity in a very delicate balance, Vladimir explained. The Rostem are their only line of defense, and they don't even know it. If we had not stopped the Tepish, this world would be nothing but Fempiror by now. If the Tepish win and take over our society, their ideals would also take over, and our world will die. How? David asked. By turning every human into Fempiror, Zechariah said. We would all have long lives, but no offspring. David was instantly confused. Offspring? He had never even considered Fempiror children. Fempiror can't have children? David asked. No, Zechariah replied. Fempiror are a sterile race. We cannot conceive at all. The only way to create a Fempiror, Vladimir said, answering his mental question, is to be transmutated. We cannot have children, so if the Tepish overrun the world, then it would be a world of Fempiror. Those who don't kill themselves would die after a few hundred years. You might call it a slow genocide, Tiberius said. That's what you fight for? David asked. It is what we have always fought for, Tiberius said. It would be far better if our people were completely destroyed, because we are such a threat to the human race. We stay, however, to protect our mother race, as it were, from total destruction from ourselves. There it was, the reason for Zechariah's passion, the reason that they care about humanity, the reason that transmutation is illegal, the reason that they fight so hard against anyone who willingly transmutates someone into a Fempiror. It isn't just some desire to be valiant or noble. It isn't a selfishness to keep their virtual immortality to themselves. It is because if the Fempiror became the only race on the planet, there would be no next generation. It brought home the meaning of the saying inside the council body hall, remember who you serve. Humanity was the answer. David realized in that moment, as he and his Rostem elders were laying down to rest for a long journey only a few hours away, that if Beth were changed, he would condemn her to lose the only thing she truly desired in this world, a family. She wanted children. He could never take that away from her. If he lived in Hoggenstown, she would never want to be away from him, and by doing so he would be taking her life and dreams away from her. Zechariah was right. He could never go back. He still wanted it more than anything in the world, but to choose between getting what he wanted and allowing her to have what she needed, he would have to let her go. He needed to say goodbye.